All right, I will say good morning. Let's begin. So we left off on excuse me. Today's daf is daf Lamed Ches. We left off on Lamed Zayin Amud Beis. So if you remember again, we left off Tanan Hasam 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 11 lines up from the bottom. Very interesting Gemara today, all about Na'anuim. Well, not all about, but the first part is about Na'anuim, about shaking the lulav. So remember again, that was the lashon of the Mishnah. We saw the Machlokes to when exactly we shake the lulav over the course of Hallel. So the Gemara now talks about shaking or waving in a different context. The Gemara says, Tanan Hasam, we learned there, and here the Gemara is quoting a Mishnah from Meseches Menachos, and the Mishnah says the following, Shtei halechem u'shtei kivsei atzeres, the two loaves and the two sheep that were brought, the two lambs that were brought on Shavuos, Keitzaru Oseh, what do you do with them? Maniach shtei alechem al gavei shnei akvasin, you place the two loaves on top of the two lambs. Umaniach yado tachtehen, and you place your hands underneath the lamb. Umenif, and you wave the lambs. What do? Umenif, umolich umevi, you move the lambs forward and backwards. Ma'ala umorid, up and down. Shene'emar asher hunaf va'asher huram. So Rabbi, we see the concept of tenufa, the concept of waving, is not just the din in the anuim of lulav, but rather again we see primarily, or at least biblically, we see them by the shtei halechem, by the offerings of Shavuos, and we also see it, by the way, where else? By bikurim. By bikurim also tenufa, the act of waving is also part of the service. Amar Rabbi Yochanan. So Rabbi Yochanan says, well, what's the symbolism of the waving? Molich umevi, and Rabbi said this applies, by the way, to the lulav as well. This applies to the lulav as well. Molich umevi, you bring it forward and backward. Why? Lemisha arba ruchos shalom. Because the act of bringing it forward and backwards indicates an idea that HaKadosh Baruch Hu is control of all four directions. Ma'ala umorid, you upward, you wave it upwards and downwards. Lemisha hashamayim va'aretz shalo, to teach us that HaKadosh Baruch Hu ultimately is in control of the earth as well as the heavens. Take a look at Rashi for just a moment. Rashi says, Lemisha arba ruchos shalo. Bless you. Rashi says, Mitzvah zu anu osim lishmo kein mara b'hanafaso. What the Hanafa demonstrates, the Hanafa in the context of a mitzvah, is by showing HaKadosh Baruch Hu's dominion, ultimately up and down, heaven and earth, all four directions. What we are ultimately demonstrating is that the world as a whole belongs to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and therefore everything we do ultimately is done for the sake of God. B'ma'arava masnu, in Eretz Yisrael, b'ma'arava masnu hachi. In Eretz Yisrael, they taught the following. Amar Rab Chama bar Okva, Amar Rab Yosi bar Rabbi Chanina, Molich umevi, we move the lulav forward and backward, Kadei la'atzar ruchos ra'os, in order to go ahead and stop detrimental winds. The Gemara discusses that there are certain winds that are detrimental for crops, certain winds that are detrimental for health, so we move the lulav forward and backward, in order to go ahead, and this is not just lulav, this is anytime we do a tenufa, in order to go ahead and stop negative winds, detrimental winds. Ma'ala umorid, we put the lulav, we shake it up and down, or move it up and down, kadei la'atzor tilalim roim, in order to stop negative or detrimental rainfall or dewfall. So again, not every type of dew ultimately is beneficial. Some of it is detrimental. So again, we move it up and down in order to avoid, or in order to stop negative or detrimental dewfall. Okay, so Rosai said this is the symbolism, by the way, of the Nanuim. And by the way, they don't have to be mutually exclusive. They can actually work very beautifully in concert together. The idea is we're expressing dominion of HaKadosh Baruch Hu in all different directions, over the directions heaven and earth. We're also asking in a physical sense to stop negative winds, to go ahead and stop negative dewfall. Amar Rabbi Yosi Rabbi Avin V'itim Rabbi Yosi Bar Zavila. Zos Omeres, this teaches us Shiyarei Mitzvah Ma'akvin Esap Harana. So I will say, what do you see from here? That Shiyarei Mitzvah. Now, what does Shiyarei Mitzvah mean? Shiyarei Mitzvah means that even a leftover part, meaning even a non-essential part of a mitzvah, has the ability to go ahead and prevent negative things from occurring. Shahari Tenufa, Shiyarei Mitzvahi, because the act of waving, Rabbi say, is not a primary part of the mitzvah, and yet Va'otzeres Ruchos Ra'os, it stops negative winds, Utilalim Ra'im, and detrimental dew. Just finish this. I know, but I'm not going to stop again. Sounds right. Okay, so the Gemara says the following. Look at Rashi, Shi'ari Mitzvah. Rashi says, Mitzvah shehi shirayim she'ena ikr la'akev kapara. If you have a part of a mitzvah that is shirayim, that is a leftover part of the mitzvah, it's not an essential part of the mitzvah, meaning that when we say essential is that it's not essential to create atonement. Nevertheless, even a quote-unquote insignificant part of the mitzvah is still strong enough to be able to offset negative things. Rashi says, Shaharei Tenufa, mitzvah. So Rashi goes on to explain. He explains actually that this is by other karbanos, other sacrificial parts. That lemaisa again tenufa is not ma'akev. So the Gemara says va'amarava v'chein belulav, and Rava says so too with lulav. Now what's so too with lulav? Look at Rashi. Molech umevi ma'ala umorid. That's so too by lulav. We do all of these things that we just described. Because also remember the tenufa that was being described on Amud Beis, on Lamed Zayin Amud Beis, was tenufa vis-a-vis the Shavuos service. So now Rava is coming along and saying, oh, and by the way, now that we've established the proper order for tenufa, that act of waving also goes ahead and applies to lulav. Rav Acha Bar Yaakov. So we'll say again, we obviously over the years have also expanded this idea. Molechu Mevi, with the Rishonim understand, not over the years, the Rishonim understand to mean that it doesn't just have to mean forward and backward. Molechu Mevi could also mean what? In all directions, which makes sense because the Gemara says that the symbolism of Molechu Mevi is what? Lami Sha'ar Baruchos Shalo. The symbolism of Molechu Mevi is that HaKadosh Baruch Hu has control over all four directions. So essentially, with the Tenufa process by Shavuos is the same tenufa process, same weaving process adopted by lulav. So the Gemara goes weiter. Rav Acha Bar Yaakov mematile umaisile. I will say just an interesting aside, which we're not going to get to it today, but the interesting discussion. Maybe we'll get to it find a different day when we have more time. Is whether or not this waving includes shaking. Right, because right now, again, this is just talking about moving the lulav in that direction. Does it include a shaking of the lulav as well? Some side discussion we'll have to have a different time. So Rav Acha Bar Yaakov would move his lulav forward and backward. Amar, and he would say, Din gira be'ena desit. This should be like an arrow in the eyes of the Satan. Okay, Velav Milsi, and the Gemara says, don't do that. It's not a good idea. Mishum da'asi legiyure bay, because ultimately, again, literally, it could incite the Satan against the person. Look at Rashi legiyure sheyiskare bo Satan shuyetzahara. Litos me'al kono. Literally, it will go ahead and incite the Satan, that is the Yetzer Hara, and the Yetzer Hara will bring a person ultimately again to transgress. So also, I just think it's an interesting idea psychologically as well. What the proper approach in life is not to test yourself. The proper approach in life is not to place yourself in harm's way. The proper approach in life, to a certain degree, at least when it comes to sin, is avoidance. Avoid situations that ultimately, again, could compromise you. People are foolish sometimes and they say, oh, I'm strong enough. I can put myself in any situation. It's never going to be a problem. It's wrong, it's stupid, it's foolish, and it's arrogant. Because when people do that, even if you escape one time, two times, you will fail. You will fail. That's just the nature of man. The proper approach when it comes to avoidance of sin is literally avoidance of sin. I try to avoid the situations that could compromise me. So the Gemara says, Rav Acha Bar Yaakov, do me a favor. Don't start up with the Satan. Not that I'm afraid. Remember, we don't believe in the guy with the pitchfork, and that's not what we're talking about. But don't start up with that. Don't incite yourself. Don't create a situation where you demonstrate that you feel you have some level of mastery over the Yetzer Hara when no man could ever truly claim to have accomplished that. Mishnah. Misha ba b'derech. We'll say another. This is very interesting Gemara today. Misha ba b'derech. This is the real coffee. Let's be honest. This is the real coffee. Misha ba b'derech v'lo haya biyado lulav. Somebody came from traveling, came from the road, came from the journey, and he didn't have a lulav with him, meaning he didn't have a lulav with him on his journey. So he gets home now. He has not yet benched lulav and estrog. So what should he do? Lito l'cheshi kanis labeso. Excuse me. So when you get home, you should take it on your table. Now I will say this lashon of taking it on your table, Rashi indicates the following: So we'll say this is what it sounds like. I was on a journey and I did not have a lulav with me. So I came home. It's the middle of the day sometime. I have not yet benched lulav and esrog. So what should I do? Now the Mishnah seems to indicate, and I sat down to eat a meal. I was hungry. hungry, and I realized, in the middle of a meal, I did not bench lulav and esrog. So what should I do? Says the Mishnah. Stop in the middle of eating, take lulav and esrog, and then continue your meal afterwards. So the Gemara says, Lo natal shachris, if you did not shake the lulav in the morning, yital bein ha'arbayim, then you could bench lulav and esrog in the afternoon. Why? Shekol hayom kosher lulav, because the entire day is kosher for netilas lulav. Says the Gemara, Amrit, Notla al shulchanom. You gave this lashon that you should take the table. You should bench lulav and esrog at your table, which the Gemara understands to mean what? Lememra demafsik. Now, ultimately, again, what that seems to indicate is what? That if you started a meal and you're in the middle of your meal, and you realize you didn't bench lulav and esrog, what should you do? Interrupt your meal. You have to interrupt your meal, mamish, in the middle of a meal to bench lulav and esrog. The Gemara says, "Ormini, b'oreis kasha, imis chilu ein mafsikin." Rabosai, the Gemara over here quotes a Gemara from Masechah Shabbos, and what is this Gemara talking about? Look at Rashi. Imis chilu ein mafsikin. Gabi tfilas hamincha tanan lava Masechah Shabbos. Lo yeshev adam lefnei asapar, v'lo yikanes lo lechol v'lo ladun. V'mis chilu kodem hamincha. Umashcha sudaso and the Igiyaz man mincha ein mafsikin ein tzrichin lahavsik sudaso. So listen to this. The Gemara Masechah Shabbos discusses the following idea: that there are certain things that you're not supposed to do at mincha time, but yet the Gemara says that what? So, for example, let's keep it simple. You're not supposed to start a suda. You shouldn't start a suda at the time that mincha comes around. Rather, what should you do? First daven mincha, then have your suda. What happens if you started your suda? So, what does the Gemara say? Ein mafsik, you don't have to stop. So here we see, for example, by mincha, that if I started my suda, I need not stop the suda from mincha. Rather, what? Finish the suda. And when I finish the suda, I'll do mincha afterwards. That contradicts our Mishnah, because what does our Mishnah say? If I started the suda, but I realized that I did not yet bench lulav and esrog, then what do I have to do? I have to be mafsik. I have to stop. So what's going on over here? Rav Safra says, no, lo kasha. It's not a contradiction. Ha di'ika shehus bayom. Hadaleka shehus bayom. So if Safra says it's not a kasha, why? Two different cases. The case by mincha is where what? There's enough time during the day. There's enough time during the day where what? I can finish my meal and there's still time for mincha afterwards. The case of the Mishnah is what, Rabbosai? I got home late in the day and I'm sitting down to eat this suda, and if I'm not mafsik now, then what? I might lose the window to perform the mitzvah. So what Rav Safra is suggesting is, essentially, if there would be enough time, you're right, you don't have to be mafsik, finish whatever you're doing. Again, I want to be clear. The lechatchila is, don't start the su'udah until you discharge the mitzvah at hand, be it mincha or be it lulav. But if you started already, you could continue as long as what? There'll be enough time later on in the day to do the mitzvah. If for some reason there's not enough time, then einach inami, you have to stop right now to do the mitzvah. Amar Rav says, I don't understand my kushya. What's the question? Dilma had da'oraisa. Hadrabanan. So Rava says you're comparing apples and oranges. You're comparing lulav to mincha. Lulav is daraisa, mincha is drabanan. So maybe when it comes to mitzvah daraisa, you have to be mafsik. Even if there's time, you still have to be mafsik right now to do it. When it comes to mitzvah drabanan, like mincha, that you don't have to be mafsik for. Ella Amar Rava. So Rava says, Ella ikasha hakasha. So Rava says, if you're going to ask a question, here's the question you should ask. L'sheikanes lebeso notlo al shulchano. What did the Mishnah say? The Mishnah said when you come into your house, you should take the lulav by your table. Alma demafsik. So both sides, the lashon of taking it at your table indicates that you already sat down to a su'udah, and therefore the Mishnah is telling me that you should interrupt your su'udah to go ahead and what? To go ahead and take lulav and esrog. But later on the Mishnah says, Lo natal shachris yital bein harbayim. But yet the same Mishnah says just a moment later that what? If you didn't take it in the morning, you could take it in the afternoon, which indicates that what? Alma lo mafsik. Which also indicates to us that you don't have to stop everything you're doing to do the mitzvah of lulav, because you have time throughout the day. Amar Rav Safra lo kasha. Rav Safra Bosai again answers his same answer. Had diika shahus bayom. Had deleka shahus bayom. Rav Safra says it's not a contradiction. Everything depends on what? Like most things in life, timing. Right? If you have time, if there's more time throughout the day to perform the mitzvah, then lemaisa, again, you don't have to stop what you're doing to perform the mitzvah. Rather, again, you can do it later. But if there's not enough time throughout the day and we're nervous that the window is going to close, then you should interrupt whatever you're doing to do the mitzvah now. Amar Rab Zeir says, my kushya, what's the question? Dilma mitzvah laf suke. V'im lo pasuk yital bein arbaim. So comes along Reb Zera and says, well, maybe it's not such a kasha. Maybe what we're saying is like this: L'chatchila, you should stop. I both say, if I came home, I didn't yet bench lulav and esrog, I sat down to eat a meal, I realized, I haven't benched lulav and esrog yet. You know what? L'chatchila, you should stop. Stop what you're doing. But what? But what if you didn't stop? Okay. If you didn't stop, you're still okay. Why? Because you could fulfill the mitzvah of lulav and esrog throughout the entire day. Shekol hayom kasher lelulav ela amar Rab Zera the olam kidarmina meikara. In reality, it's as we said before. I udekashi lecha had oraisa. Look at Rashi will say amar Rab Zera the olam ki itzrich Rav Safra l'shanuye mishum kushya kamaise itzrich. So Rabbi say, in reality, we're going to go back and really go with the original approach of Rav Safra. So the Gemara says, but what? So we'll say, we asked the question that how can you compare it to the Mishnah in Shabbos? Because after all, again, the Mishnah in Shabbos is it d'oraisa and when is it d'rabanan? Hacha b'yom tov sheni d'rabanan askinan. What's the case of the Mishnah? Abba say it's very interesting. The case of the Mishnah is a case of Yom Tov Sheni. Abba say if it's meaning that it's the second day Yom Tov. And what's the raya to that? What's the raya that it's Yom Tov Sheni? And Abba say that Yom Tov Sheni doesn't have to mean just second day Yom Tov. Yom Tov Sheni means any day after the first. What's the raya that it's the second day? Dekunami midiktani misheba baderech ve'in biyad lulav. Because what's the lashon? Lashon is somebody comes from a journey and he didn't have a lulav in his hand. The Succah, meaning he didn't have a lulav with him. The Succah b'yom tov rishon mishari. Is there a concept of journeying on the first day of Yom Tov? Rabbi, so we've seen this concept. That's what. Now that's why again when he says Yom Tov Sheni doesn't have to mean like our Yom Tov Sheni, which we celebrate as Yom Tov Rishon. Means second day Yom Tov, which in Eretz Yisrael already is Chol HaMoed. So the Gemara therefore says the case of the Mishnah is talking about a case of really Chol HaMoed, or any day past the first day. Because is somebody going to be journeying on the first day of Yom Tov? The answer is of course not. So the Ma'aseh Rabbi say what comes out from this Mishnah is the following yisod, which is that halacha lemaisa, if one came home and did not yet go ahead and bench lulav and esrog, so halacha lemaisa, they should do that first thing before anything else. However, again, if one did sit down for a seuda and then realize in the middle of the seuda that I have not yet benched lulav and esrog, so the truth is, lechatchila, a person should stop. A person should really stop and bench lulav and esrog right then and there. If a person did not, it's okay also, provided that what? There's more time throughout the day to be able to bench lulav and esrog. If a person is worried that if they went to Suda, literally the window is going to close, then halacha l'maisa, a person must stop in order to fulfill the mitzvah. Says the Mishnah, Misha haya, and this is another interesting sugya, Misha haya eved o isha o katan makrino. So, both say, listen to this. So now we're transitioning to a discussion about halal. So let's say a person, the way he was reciting halal is that he had an eved, a servant, or a woman, or a katan, or a child, makrinoso. They were reading the phrase for him, and he in this case, by the way, is an adult male. And makrinoso, Ona acharein ma shehin omrim. So Rabosai, he answers after what they are saying. Now look at Rashi. Rashi says, makrinoso, kacha you know again. This was often the way they conducted themselves, meaning in davening. Echad kori es halal. One would read the halal, umotzi es harabim, and he would discharge the obligation of the collective. Vim haya eved o isha o katan, hoil ve'in michuya bedavar, ein motzi es hamechuyev midi chava. So hilchach ona acharav kol mashum omer. I'll say now this is very interesting. Halacha l'maisa. In order, we're going to touch on the concept of shomea ka'ona. So shomea ka'ona means what? If let's say again you recite something, I could be yotze with your recitation if I listen, and you have in mind to discharge my obligation, provided that what? We are on the same level of obligation. You have to have the same level of obligation in order to discharge. So, for example, again, I can go ahead Right, we're all having a Shabbos Suda together. One of us can make Kiddush on behalf of the rest, the collective, as long as we're all listening. And then Mekadosh, one who's making Kiddush, could go ahead and be motzi and has in mind to discharge everyone's obligation. That's because we're all on the same level. But if you have two people on dissimilar levels of obligation, well, the one on the higher level of obligation could discharge one on the lower level of obligation, but not vice versa. So, for example, says the Gemara over here that like this: if you have an individual who is now reciting. So I'm sorry. Let me say it differently. So therefore, Rashi says the way they used to recite Hallel was that they have the tzibur and their chazan would say Hallel out loud, and everyone else would listen, and they would discharge their obligation with the recitation of the chazan. Let's say, however, the person who's reciting it for you doesn't share your same level of obligation. The person is an eved, a servant, not obligated like you, an isha, not obligated like you, and Hallel is still part of a mitzvah shazman grama. A katan, a child who's not obligated. So what happens in that case? So in that case, the halacha is, if they recite Hallel, in order for me to discharge my obligation, what do I have to do? I have to repeat. So I'm not utilizing Shomea Ka'ona. Essentially, what am I doing? Well, I'm saying Hallel. I'm reciting Hallel. Just, again, obviously, this is a case of ignorance where the person does not know how to recite Hallel, and therefore, again, these individuals who are not obligated, they can't be motzi me, they're saying it and I'm repeating it. But look what the Mishnah says, V'tavo lo me'era. But a curse should come upon such a man. That's pretty stark. So the Gemara says, the Mishnah says, what does that mean? Tavo lo me'era. Shelo lamad. So cursed be such a person who allows himself to remain in such a state of ignorance that he doesn't know how to recite Hallel, and the only way he can discharge his obligation is by hearing it from others who aren't even obligated in the same way. So both again, Rashi says again, you're cursed. Either because, again, both say, there's no punishment for being ignorant. There is a punishment for sustaining ignorance. Sometimes a person is ignorant because they didn't know, they didn't have the opportunity to learn. So, okay, that's fine. But once you become an adult, you have mastery over your circumstances. If you choose to remain ignorant, for that you are liable. So the Mishnah says a curse should come upon the person who allows himself to remain in a state of ignorance that he can't go ahead and even recite Hallel for himself. So the Gemara says, Imhaya Gadol, Makre also. Brabosai again, on the other hand, if you had a Gadol means an adult male. If an adult male was reciting the Hallel, so now again, Brabosai, you have someone who shares your same level of obligation, then Makre also, Ona Acharav, hallelujah. So what happens, Brabosai? In that case, what they would do is, so the Gadol, the Chazan would read it, and everyone else would simply respond, hallelujah. Hallelujah. That's what they would respond. That was the equivalent of Amen for Hallel. Rashi points out, Onin Acharav Hallelujah, Akol Davar Shu Omer. So every single time he would say something, again, we'll see, was it after every statement, was it after every paragraph? This was the response for Hallel. So again, boss, I remember, this is reflecting also a different mode of tefillah. The original mode of tefillah was much more a passive experience on the part of the congregation. The chazan did the active parts, the congregation did listening, and they were yotze ultimately with the shliach tzibur. So apparently with Hallel as well, the shliach tzibur would say it, they would answer Hallelujah, and that would be it. Makom shenahagu lichpal. It's very interesting. Just in general, I always find that it's interesting to see like evolution of the halachic and prayer experience, because that's what often happens. So just see how they used to do Hallel to contrast with how we do it now. So the Mishnah goes on. He says, "Makom shenagu." Makom shenagu lichpol yichpol. In where you have a minhag to go ahead and repeat phrases in Hallel. You can repeat phrases in Hallel. So Rabbi say again, we know we do this in certain parts in Hallel, and we will see historically different parts of Hallel were repeated. Liv shot, yiv shot. If the custom is to go ahead and just recite a particular verse once, you just recite it once. Or in other words, Rabbi say levarich yivarich, to make a bracha, make a bracha. Now this is not referring to the bracha at the beginning of Hallel. This is referring to the bracha at the end of Hallel. Everyone agrees that you make a bracha at the beginning of Hallel. There were different minhagim as to what you do at the end of Hallel. Hakol kamina gamadina. Well, it's very interesting. When it comes to Hallel, everything follows the standard custom of where you live. There were varying customs from locale to locale. Tan Rabbanan, says the Gemara, Be'emes Amru, listen to this. In reality, we have said, Ben mevarich laviv, a son could go ahead and literally make a bracha for his father. Ve'eved mivarich l'rabo, and a servant could make a bracha for his master. Ve'isha mivareches l'bayla, and a woman could discharge her husband's obligation. Look at Rashi for just a moment. Ben mivarich la'aviv, bebirkas hamazon. So here, the Gemara is quoting, this is a sugi Rabosai. We saw the sugya about a year and a half ago in Maseches Brachos. So Rashi points out over here, Ben mevarich la'aviv, birkas hamazon, mishiagia lechinuch, dechayiv midrabanan, ub'Maseches Brachos perak mishamesu moki gon shlo achol aviv ele kizayis o kebetza, dahavi shiura drabanan debin daraisa lo mechayiv ad desava. Listen to this. So remember, the Gemara says, technically speaking, a child, once he reaches the age of chinuch, could bench on behalf of his father, and his father could listen, answer amen to his son's brachos, and the father could be yotzei. Now, you'll say, how could that be? Because again, we only say shomek only works when people enjoy the same level of obligation. So the answer is like this: Rabbi say you are only chayiv to bench midaoraisa if what? If a person is satiated. Let's say again, I'm not satiated. I ate a kizayis of bread. I have a rabbinic obligation to bench. Well, if an adult male eats only kizayis of bread, is a rabbinic obligation to bench. A child who's reached the age of chinuch has a rabbinic obligation to bench. Similarly, a woman. Now again, woman is interesting when it comes to birkas hamazon. Let's assume for now, for just a moment, that a woman, well, truth is, you could even say, let's keep it easier. A woman has a biblical obligation to bench. A man has a biblical obligation to bench. An eved may have a rabbinic obligation to bench, and there's adom ev. So therefore, in all of these cases, technically speaking, because these two people enjoy the same level of obligation, a wife could recite birkas hamazon on behalf of her husband. She has in mind to discharge his obligation. He has in mind to discharge his obligation. And lemaisa what? And therefore, again, he could be yotzei. The son could bench on behalf of his father. And again, assuming they have all the right kavanas, he could be yotzei eved as well. So technically, it works. But aval amru chachamim tavo me'era li adam she'ishto ubanav mivarchin lo. A curse should come upon a man whose wife and whose children have to go ahead and bench on his behalf. Rashi points out, Sheishto banav mevarchin lo, devadai machmas shalo lamatu. So Chazal say it works. But woe to the person who has to use this. Woe to the person who is so significantly ignorant that he cannot bench on his own, and he needs to rely on his child, and he needs to rely on his wife, or needs to rely on his servant to discharge his obligation. So technically, mechanistically, it works, but again, says Chazal, what a sorry state of affairs for a man who has to rely on this. Hilchasa. So now, fine, that's the end of that. Amar Rava said, Hilchasa givirta ika lemashma min hagid dehalila. Rava said, now this is really fascinating, and I encourage you, it's a fast day. Hopefully you'll have a little bit of downtime over the course of the day. I'm giving you advance warning. I'm not going to do justice to this sugya just because of timing. This is fascinating. What Rav is saying is like this. Hallel over time has evolved. It's evolved. It's looked different ways over the ages. Now, how do we know that already? How do we know that Hallel's looked, what? Why? Minagamakom, right? Because what did the Mishnah say? Essentially, when it comes to Hallel, everything is kiminagamadina. So what Rava points out is that our Rava is pretty much referring to the Hallel we have today. That our Hallel that we have today contains almost allusions to all different types of Halelim and all different types of halachos that have been in effect over the ages. That's why he says, Amar Rava, Hilchasa gavirta ikala masha minhaga. You could learn many great halachos from Mimin Hagid Halila, from our Hallel. So listen to this. Hu Omer Hallelujah, Vehein Omrim Hallelujah. He, and whenever you see he, I'm sorry, who means he, right? Well, obviously, right? Who, the he refers to the Shliach Tzibor, refers to the Chazan. So Hu Omer Hallelujah, whenever the Chazan recites Hallelujah, Hein Omrim Hallelujah. The Tzibor responds Hallelujah. What do we see from here? Mikan shemitzvah la'anos Hallelujah. From here we see the Rabbosai that whenever you hear Hallelujah, the proper response is what? Is Hallelujah. Hu Omer Hallelu Avdei Hashem. When the Shliach Tzibor says Hallelu Avdei Hashem, Vehein Omrim Hallelujah. They respond Hallelujah. Mikan Shem Haya Gadol Makreoso. Ona acharav hallelujah. From here we see what Rabbi saying, that if Hallel is being led by an adult male, that essentially we could rely on Shomea Ka'ona, and Shomea Ka'ona says that whatever the Shliach Tzibur says, it's as if you said it yourself, and therefore you need not actually recite the words. All you need to do is answer a response in the affirmative. So whereas normally a response in the affirmative would be Amen, for Hallel the response in the affirmative is Hallelujah. Hu Omer Hodu La Hashem. The Chazan says Hodu La Hashem. The Hein Omrim Hodu La Hashem. And the Tzibor responds Hodu La Hashem. What do we see from here? Mikan Shemitzvah La'anos Rashi Prakim. From here we see that in Hallel there is a mitzvah to repeat the beginnings of each paragraph. That after the Chazan says it, the Tzibor repeats just the beginning phrase of the paragraph as well. Itmar Nami. So too it was stated. Amar Rav Chanan bar Rava. Mitzvah la'anos Rashi prakim. It is a mitzvah to go ahead and repeat the beginnings of the paragraph. So Rabbi say again, the way it works, obviously our recitation of Hallel is different because in our Hallel, we do not rely on Shomea Kona, we do not rely on the Chazan really for anything. We say it ourselves, but at some point in time, even when they relied on the Chazan to recite it, the Chazan would recite the opening words of the paragraph and everyone would repeat those same opening words. Hu Omer Ana Hashem Hoshiana. The Chazan says, Ana Hashem, please Hashem, provide us with salvation, save us. And they also say, Ana Hashem Hoshiana. What do we see from here? Mikan Shim Haya Katan Makre also Onin Acharav. From here we see Rabbi say that's what? That if there was a katan leading Hallel, that you cannot rely on Shomea Kona, and what would you do? You'd have to repeat the same words after the katan. So Rabbi say, what Rav is pointing out over here is that certain of these practices were built into Hallel as a way of what? As a way of what? As a way of remembering the halachos. It's fascinating, right? Yes, thank you. Right? It's riveting because why? Because what it's saying is that Chazal structured Hallel in a way that the halachos were built into it, even though it was not necessarily pertinent to that particular recitation. So therefore, some things we'll say responsively, some things we'll just say hallelujah. Here, we're going to say, the Chazan says, Ana Hashem Hoshiana. We repeat Ana Hashem Hoshiana. What's that a remez to? That's a remez that if for some reason your halal is being led by a katan, remember, you can't use the concept of Shomea Kona by a katan, because the katan is not on the same level as the adult male. Therefore, what do? The katan says you have to repeat every word after him. Hu Omer Ana Hashem Atzlichana. The Chazan says Ana Hashem Hatzlichana. Vehein Omer, and they say Ana Hashem Hatzlichana. Mikan she'imba lichba kofel. What do we see from that? So Rabbi say, from the repetition of Ana Hashem Hoshiana, we learn that if a katan was leading Hallel, you have to repeat every word after him. From the repetition of Ana Hashem Hatzlichana, what do we learn? We learn that if you want to double up, if you want to repeat phrases in Hallel, you have the right to do so. I'll say, again, remember, in other places in Tefillah, it's not pashut that you could just repeat anything you want, but in Hallel, apparently we have the license to repeat whatever we want. Hu Omer Baruch Haba, Vehin Omrim B'Shem Hashem. The Chazan says, apparently again, in earlier forms of Hallel, the Chazan would say Baruch Haba, and the Tzibra would answer B'Shem Hashem. Mikan L'Shomea Ka'oneh. And Rabbi say, from here we see the concept of Shomea Ka'ona. Rabbi say, the fact that I don't have to recite Baruch Haba, but I can go ahead and just simply rely on the Chazan's recitation of Baruch Haba, and all I need to do is articulate B'Shem Hashem, indicates that what I hear from the Chazan is as if what? As if I've said it myself. Ba'u minei mi Rabbi Chia bar Abba. They asked Rabbi Chia bar Abba the following question. Shama v'lo ana mahu. Rabbi say, what happens if a person heard but did not answer? Shama v'lo ana. So we'll say this is in a case of, now we're saying Shomea Ka'ona. So Shomea Ka'ona, so normally requires some type of response. Whether that response is Amen, whether that response is Hallelujah, whether that response is B'Shem Hashem, you normally need something. What happens if you listened but you didn't respond? Amar Lahu. So he said to him, again, the Rabbi Chia bar Abba responded, Amar Lahu Chachimaya, the scholars, V'Safriya, the teachers, V'Reisham, the leaders of the people, V'Darshan, Darshanim, Amru, they all said, Shama v'lo ana yatsa. That Rabbi say, if you had kavanah to listen and to discharge your obligation and to be yotzei, even if you did not respond with any type of affirmation, you are still yotzei. Itmar Nami Amr Rabbi Shem ben Pazi Amr Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi Mishum Bar Kafra Minayin l'shomea ka'ona. From where do we know the concept of shomea ka'ona? Rabbi said this is very interesting. So remember, shomea ka'ona is a major concept for us. So where do we find the proof to it that it exists, that such a concept like this exists? It's very interesting. It comes from Navi, at least for now. It comes from Navi. Where do we see it in Navi? Dichsiv, es hadvarim asher kara Yoshiyahu. So listen to this. So the pasuk talks about, Rabbi saying, the idea that it's talking about when Yoshiyahu becomes king. Yoshiyahu becomes king at a very young age, and the Beis Hamikdash is in total disarray. Yoshiyahu orders for a cleanup and and fixing up of the Beis Hamikdash. They found the Sefer Torah that was kept in the Azara. That Sefer Torah was normally kept by Bereshis. They found it, they opened it up, and they found that it was by the Tochacha. It was by the series of curses in Devarim. Yoshiyahu took this as a very serious, terrible omen, and therefore really sparked a tshuva campaign. Rabbi Osai, if you remember again, on Tisha B'Av, we have a kina, and the kina is Vayikonin Yirmiyahu al Yoshiyahu. Yoshiyahu was the last king during the first temple era. It was when he died. That was the nail in the coffin. That was it. Yoshiyahu was killed in battle. So ultimately, again, so what happened? So the Navi says that Yoshiyahu read all of these things that he found when he opened the Torah. So the Gemara says, 1 second. V'chi Yoshiyahu Karan. Did Yoshiyahu read from the scroll when they found it? It's not true. V'halo Shafan Karan. Shafan Rabbosai was the one who read from the Torah, Dichsiv, because the pasuk says, Vayikra Shafan, Vayikari Shafan Lifnei HaMelech. Shafan, remember, Chilkiyahu, who was the Kohen Gadol, found it. He gave it to Shafan, and Shafan read the Torah before King Yoshiyahu. Vayikaru Shafan is called Rama'il Lifnei HaMelech. So what says, what do you see from here? Shafan was the one who read it. What was Yoshiyahu doing? He was listening, and yet what does the pasuk say? That Yoshiyahu read it. What do we see from here? Mikan l'shomea ka'ona. From here we see that what? That when you listen to something with intent, it is as if you read it yourself. So Gemara says, well, maybe not. V'dilma basa dekaranu Shafan kara Yoshiyahu. Maybe after Shafan read it, Yoshiyahu read it afterwards. Amar Rav Acha bar Yaakov lo sakadaitcha dichsev ya'an rach levavcha. That can't be why, because later on the Navi says to Yoshiyahu that because your heart was soft and you humbled yourself before God when you heard the words of the Torah. The words of the Torah that the Navi is referring to is what? When Yoshiyahu heard that the Tochacha was being read. So what do you see from here? That Yoshiyahu himself never read the words of the Torah, rather in this context. Rather what happened? He heard it being read by Shafan, and yet what? The Navi reckons it as if Yoshiyahu read it himself. B'shamacha. So clearly see Yoshiyahu only heard it below bikar acha, and ultimately again never read it himself. What do you see from here, Rabbi Osai? That shomea ka'ona. So this is fascinating. That the concept of shomea ka'ona, in fact, does not seem to have a biblical origin. Although we'll talk about this more tomorrow. But rather, again, it seems to be that the proof for it comes from this episode with Yoshiyahu Hanavi. Rabbi Osai, I just point out over here. If you take a look at Tosos for just a moment, Tosos says, Shama v'lo ana yatsa. Tosos says, Mish eni yodea likros v'lo la'anos, im shama v'kiven es libo l'shmoa, afa pishlo ana yatsa. Rabbi say that this is halacha l'maisa, that again, if a person does not know how to read, a person doesn't know how to recite something, and you listen, and your kavan is to discharge your obligation, even if you do not answer in the affirmative, with an amen and halaluka, b'shem Hashem, whatever it is, you're yotzei. Rabbi saying this is very important. V'chein l'mispalelin b'tzibor, v'shliach tzibor omer kedusha, o yehesh mei rabba mevarach, yishasku mitfilasan, v'yishmeu, v'harei heim ka'onin. Rabbi said this is very interesting. Now, this actually, again, I'm going to give this to you, but we're not going to have time to really go through it now. Take good care. Just pass it around quickly. So I'll just show you only in the 1 minute that we have. What Tosas points out over here is you see from this sugya that what? That lemaisa shamea ka'ona works even if what Rabbi say, even if you don't answer anything. Now this is very interesting because if you take a look, I've xeroxed for you over here from Hilchos Tefillah Simin Kuf Dalet Sif Zayin, top of the page. The Shulchan Aruch writes, Eino posek Eino posek lo lekadish v'lo lekdusha eli yishtok v'yichavi l'mashamar shatz v'yehei ka'ona. So halacha, let's say I'm in the middle of Shmona Esrei. I'm in the middle of Shmona Esrei. What happens? And the chazan gets up to Kaddish or Kedusha. So what do I do if I'm in the middle of Shmona Esrei? I'm quiet. I don't say anything. I listen to what the chazan is saying. I have kavana, and it's like what? It's like Shomea Ka'ona. Now, I was saying, here's the problem. If it's like Shomea Ka'ona, then what? Then what? Then why isn't that a hefsek in the middle of Shmona Esrei? Look at what the Mishnah Berurah says. The Mishnah Berurah says, V'hei Ka'ona, Chav Ches, just quickly, V'hei Ka'ona, Le'inyan sheyatze bazeh yedei chiv kaddish kedusha, u'mikol makom l'chashiv hefsek. So this is interesting, right? We're, to a certain degree, we're almost like talking out of two sides of our mouth. What we're saying is, L'meisa, real Shomea Ka'ona requires what? Requires an affirmation, requires a verbal affirmation on the part of the listener. B'diavad, if you didn't answer, it works. But l'maisa, as long as there's no verbal affirmation, it's not a hefsek. So therefore, we kind of play this both ways. So therefore, halacha l'maisa, if I'm in the middle of Shmona Esrei, I cannot go ahead and be mafsik. But at the same time, I don't want to miss the Kaddish, I don't want to miss the Kedusha, I don't want to miss the Baruch Hu, to which the halacha says it's okay, based on this Tosis, based on this Gemara, that Shomea Ka'ona works even if you're not answering, but because there's no verbal affirmation, it doesn't count as a hefsek. So it counts as if I'm Yosei, as if I heard it, but it doesn't count as a hefsek because I'm not answering. Therefore, halacha this is the Shulchan Aruch. If I'm in the middle of Shmona Esrei, and there's Kaddish, Kedusha, Baruch Hu, what's the proper protocol? Stop what you're doing, listen, even concentrate on what they're doing. That discharges my obligation. That's as if I've recited it, but at the same time does not create a hefsek in my Shmona Esrei. All right, so we'll stop over here.